So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Noshin Premji, and I'm the Project and Events Coordinator here at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to this evening's book launch, Command and Creation, a Shi'i Cosmological Treatise, edited and translated by our very own Dr. Daryoush Mohammad Poor. A special welcome also to those of you who are joining us online through our live webcast. Tonight's book launch will last approximately 1 hour and will be followed by light refreshments in the atrium. There will be an opportunity for questions to be asked towards the end of the event. For those of you joining us online, please submit your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We do not have a lot of time allocated for questions, but we will endeavour to get through as many of those as possible throughout the event. A couple of housekeeping rules before we begin. We are not planning on having a fire drill tonight, so if the alarm does sound, please calmly make your way through the doors and downstairs and out of the building through the main entrance and exits. Please also take a moment to ensure that your mobile devices remain on silent or are switched off. Unfortunately, we are not permitted to sell copies of the publication here tonight. However, we have a few copies that we've made available for you to look through, which you'll find on the desk just to my right-hand side. These are both in hardback and paperback formats. So if you wish to purchase a copy, please take a look at the flyer that's also placed on the desk, and there will be flyers on your seats available as well. This contains a 20% discount code, so it's a nice little save-in from the paperback edition if you were to purchase the book from Bloomsbury's website. For those of you who are joining us online, we will send you a copy of that flyer so you won't miss out. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Orkhan Mir-Kasimov, who will be moderating this evening's conversations and will be introducing our speakers. Orkhan is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Ismaili Studies and the series editor of the Ismaili Texts and Translation series. He is senior fellow at the Higher Education Academy and teaches courses on the history of the Islamic world as part of the IIS educational programs. His research and publications address intellectual history of Islam with a focus on Shi'i and Sufi mystical and messianic trends. Please join me in welcoming Orkhan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Noshin, for this kind introduction. Good evening to everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this book launch today. As Noshin mentioned, the book we will be presenting today is Command and Creation, a Persian edition and English translation of Muhammad al-Shahrastani's Majlis-i Maktub, edited and translated by Dr. Daryoush Mohammad Poor. This book is 25th publication in the Islamic Texts and Translation series, published by the Institute of Ismaili Studies since the beginning of the century. So the first book was published in 2000. Right? The Ismaili Text and Translation series seeks, as indicated by the title, to promote the research on and the knowledge of the Ismaili written heritage by providing high-quality critical editions of the Ismaili texts and of the texts closely related with Ismaili history and doctrines, as well as English translations of these texts, making them available to the scholars, to the Ismaili community, and to the broader readership. Muhammad al-Shahrastani is a familiar figure in the Ismaili Text and Translation series. He's struggling with the philosopher, a refutation of Avicenna's Metaphysics, a new Arabic edition and English translation of al-Shahrastani's Kitab al-Musarra'a, was published by Wilfred Madlung and Toby, who is today with us as well. And it was the second publication actually in the Ismaili Texts and Translations. And this brings me to our discussions today. Let me introduce Dr. Daryoush Mohammad Poor. a senior research associate in the Department of Academic Research and Publications, lecturer for the Department of Graduate Studies, and the editor of the Ismaili Heritage Series publications of the IES. Daryoush Mohammad Poor is also a fellow of the Higher Education Academy in the UK. His main area of research, his main area of expertise is Ismaili philosophy and intellectual history. Dr. Toby is a senior research associate at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, where his research and publications have included Shahrastani's Critique of Avicenna and Shahrastani's Quran commentary, Keys to the Arcana, covering the introduction and the commentary on the opening chapter of the Quran on Al-Fatiha. The first volume of his commentary on Quran chapter 2, Al-Baqarah, is due to be published later this year. So let's, to start our discussion today, maybe my first question will be to Daryoush. Daryoush, how you came to this idea of working with this particular text of Shahrastani? Were there any personal motivation behind this?
Yeah, thank you, Orkhan. This the text of the Majlis is a book that I've been living with for maybe about 30 years. I was very young when I came across this book in Iran, when I was still living in Mashhad. A friend, Mr. Nizari Ismaili, who happened to be a graduate of the IIS as well, one of the very early graduates of the IIS. He gave me the text, and at that time, the text was rather undecipherable for me. It was not quite the way that I'm looking at it today, because for the next 2 decades, I was trying to see Shahrastani from a perspective which was fundamentally different from the way I look at it, because all my effort was trying to show that Shahrastani had no connection with Ismailis. And it took me another decade to realize that I need to look at the opposite perspective. So when I was reading the text, at the same time, I was comparing the text of Shahrastani with the extant material of the Nizari Ismaili literature from the Alma period, including those works attributed to Tusi, and the ones which form the corpus of Nizari Ismaili doctrines, including Sayr Suluk, Tasawwurat or Rawzai Tasneem, and the Haft Bab, which at that time was published by Iwanov and later on until we've got the recent one by edited by Dr. Daryoush at the IIS. When I was looking through those texts, I was seeing parallels and very close similarity between the kinds of terminologies and the arguments that Shahrastani was using in these texts, and the affinity or the similarity was unmistakable. So it was very difficult to tell them apart, but it was very puzzling for me to see how a heresiographer or somebody known as an Ash'ari theologian could share so much with the Nizari Ismailis from a completely different perspective, from a different context. So for quite a long time, it was puzzling to me, and it took me another decade to really make those connections between Shahrastani and Ismaili doctrines.
Thank you, Daryoush. Toby, do you want to add something on your personal connections with Shahrastani?
Sure. Basically, my first big project at the Institute, the aforementioned project with Wilfred Madelung on the critique of Ibn Sina, was how I got into it, although that flowed fairly naturally from my doctoral thesis, which I was still completing at the time, which was on critiques of Ibn Sina, well, the reception and critique of Ibn Sina. Mainly focused on commentaries on Ishtarat. Shahrastani's critique, for its part, turns out to have a rather distinct point of view, which is Ismailism. I mean, in the sense that he is criticizing Ibn Sina from positions which are demonstrably Ismaili at a deeper level. So this then led fairly naturally to look at the great repository of his higher thought, his Ismaili thought, which is the sister text to the Majlis, which is his Quran commentary. So that is my project. But in terms of personal motivation, I need to be very simple about it. It does go back to the Zahir Batin idea, and Shahrastani really delivers on this idea that exoteric Islam enshrines at a deeper level an esoteric religion. I think Shahrastani really articulates that very thoroughly.
Yes, thank you. And of course, you both already touched on this question, and we can have a general idea of why this book is published in, why Shahrastani's books were published in Ismaili text and translations. Do you want to develop a little bit more on the connection of why Shahrastani is important for Ismaili studies?
Well, if I may go first, I think the key idea is that for quite a while, I mean, particularly after Guy Monod wrote his entry in the Encyclopedia on Shahrastani, and also the various articles that he wrote, and he was concluding that Shahrastani could not have been other than an Ismaili, at least towards the end of his life. So the idea that Shahrastani could have indeed been a senior figure in the Ismaili Dawah was, of course, a fundamental one. But then it's a little bit deeper than that, because as I mentioned a little bit earlier, when you look at the later texts, the doctrinal and philosophical texts which were produced by Nizari Ismailis after the death of Shahrastani. Remember that Shahrastani lived almost at the end of the life of Hassan Sabbah, and towards the very early years of the life of Hassan II, known as al-Salam, who declares the Qiyama. Now, almost every single text that you find written in the Alamut period by the Nizaris is deeply under the influence of the terminology, the methodology, and the kind of arguments that Shahrastani uses both in the Majlis and in the Tafsir, particularly in the Asrar sections of the Mafatih al-Asrar and Masabih al-Abrar. So the Ismaili element of it is that if you want to understand what is going on in the Ismaili doctrines in the Alamut period, it's just a natural entry point of being able to figure it out. The second point that was particularly important for me, because it was the doctrine of Qiyama. Because apart from the primary sources of the post-Qiyamah era, which is after Al-Shahrastani's time, we've got a text which comes immediately before the declaration of the Qiyamah. It's as if we have a blueprint, as if we have a map of what is being unfolded in the era of resurrection, and explained in more detail by the Ismaili Imam. Now, those particular terms, the vocabularies, the terminologies, the dyads in particular, I think Toby will be able to expand a little bit more on that, are those which are peculiarly Ismaili. There are some scholars who suggested, well, other communities could have shared these ideas, but the more I look at the particular historical period in which Shahrastani was writing, I find it extremely difficult to find any other community other than Nizari Ismailis to have shared and have used and have deployed this repository of terms to elaborate on the doctrines. So if you want to add anything on the dyads?
I'll come on to the dyads in a second. I think the thing which has to be sort of a preface to what we're saying is Shahrastani's wider profile in Muslim thought, Muslim intellectual history. And by any standards, he was a major figure. He was prominent in the Sunni revival under the Seljuks, primarily as a neo-Asharite. And this is the revised, slightly more philosophical form of Asharism, emanating, it's popularly said, from Ghazali. And Ghazali was, of course, Shahrastani's older contemporary. He's also justly famous for his world survey of religious and philosophical teachings, which is referenced ever after for people interested in doxography. So he's a major figure. He's also a Seljuk courtier. He's the head of Sultan Sanjar's chancellery and his confidant, and involved in the Nizamiya madrasas. So by any standards, he is a major figure in wider Islamic thought. So then the full unveiling of Shahrastani as an Ismaili and more specifically as coming in the first phase of the unfolding of Nizari Ismailis, and makes him a very serious object of study at the Institute.
Thank you. And you mentioned several ideas of Shahrastani which bring close to the Shi'i, the Ismaili thought. Can you speak about some prominent Shi'i ideas in the Majlis?
I think the most important element that you find in the Majlis is the necessity and the inevitability of a rightly guided teacher. So this is exactly the same term that Hassan al-Sabai uses to refer to the Ismaili Imam, and that is the Mu'allim al-Sadiq, or the truthful teacher, the truthful instructor. Now, the subject of that instruction is, of course, the knowledge of God, because he's mentioned this also at the in the section in the Milal when he talks about the taʿlīmis, that when you ask them what is it that this teacher teaches you, they will always tell you that this our God is the God of Muhammad, and then the subject of it is Tawheed. Now, so you've got a combination of the doctrine of Tawheed, the doctrine of Imamat, and that Imamat is particularly when you read the Majlis, is that the Shi'i themes of the inseparability of the scripture, in this case the Quran, and the people from the Prophet's household is one of the most integral elements that you find in the Majlis, but also expressed in the Tafsir as well, because he finds them as twins, which is a different way of saying that famous Saghalain hadith, which is a very Shi'i theme. And then you come to the doctrine of Qiyāmat. So you've got the doctrine of Tawheed, you've got the doctrine of Imamat itself, as Imam being the manifestation of God's command, and also the doctrine of Qiyāmat, which is the very epitome, or which is very core or gist of Ismaili doctrines, that all the exoteric aspects of faith have an allegorical, have an esoteric, deeper meaning, which is the fundamental purpose of what you find in religion.
Thank you. Toby, do you want to add something on the prominent Shi'i ideas in Shahrastani rules?
Shahrastani in general.
Yes.
That is a very big question, because if you look carefully, it's all over the place. But if you want me to go through the basics of his system, and we see how it connects with Majlis. So obviously the system is manifold in its applications, but at its core, I would suggest that it is elegant and rather simple. It consists of these double principles, dyads, one might call them. And Shahrastani applies this to the interpretation of scripture, to solving central issues of philosophy, to religion in general. And the first and most fundamental, most foundational of these double principles is the command and creation. And it's prominent enough in the Majlis for Daryoush Mohammad to have titled the Majlis as Command and Creation in the English translation of his edition. So the command is clearly distinguished by Shahrastani from creation in typical Ismaili fashion. He bases this partly on a verse in the Quran, أَلَا لَهُ الْخَلْقُ وَالْأَمْرُ, is not the creation of the command. Therefore, the command is separate from creation. It is uncreated. And we really can distinguish two facets to the command. The prescriptive command, which is the familiar sense of God's commandments in the Quran to humanity, the theological basis of ethics and law. But I would suggest more philosophically interesting is this idea of the creative command. So you have the prescriptive command and the creative command. And this comes down to the word kun, this idea which is referred to recurrently in the Quran, that God projects things into existence and ultimately the universe in entirety through the word be. And this is a very familiar focus for reflection in the Ismaili tradition, of course. Shahrastani distinguishes really two things here, the masdar and the mazhar. So there's a point of origin, but there is also a manifestation on earth of this metacosmic reality, and that is ultimately the Imam for Shahrastani. He has a very intriguing interpretation of the verses in the Quran on Iblis's refusal to bow down with the angels to Adam, who is the archetype of this idea of the mazhar of the command on earth. And he locates all religious deviations and errors in this Iblisian refusal. This is a very interesting passage because he finally gets to Muslim groupings and he criticizes the Amma for failing to acknowledge this epiphany command. But he also criticizes the awaiting Shi'a, a Shi'a al-Muntazira, for the same thing. They do not acknowledge al-Imam al-Hadir al-Hayy al-Qa'im, the current present Imam Qa'im. And it's impossible to read a section like this without realizing that by a sheer process of elimination, this is an Ismaili talking. And it baffles me that people still resist this idea that Shahrastani is Ismaili. I would also add that the Quran is very important for Shahrastani, and he carries over something of his Ash'ari sensibility here. The Quran is also a manifestation of the command in our human world. And this, so it's a kind of condensed facsimile, is the way I think of it, of the command. And it leads him to some of his most intriguing interpretations because he takes every unit word and letter even of the Quran as giving some kind of access to what he calls the world of the command, which is presupposed by the world of creation. So, shall I talk about the Tayyats? I think you should.
Yeah, I think that there's one thing that I would add here is that you mentioned this dialogue between God and Iblis here.
Yes.
Now, interestingly, I think you could add some more on that one. Interestingly, the terms which are used here in the context of the dialogue between Iblis and God is that basically he phrases that conversation between them. He says that Iblis is accusing God of forcing everybody to imitate. He calls this taʿlīm because you're asking us to just, without asking any questions, prostrate before Adam, and then this is not basira. This is taslim. This is taʿlīm. Now, interestingly, in the Melal, towards the very end of that section of the Ta'limiyya I mentioned earlier, he addresses, he includes a few lines, seemingly him being critical of the Ta'limis. And then he uses those very terms, taslim, taqlid, and then basira. But then in the majlis, and also I think in the tafsir, his response is that it is only the followers of Iblis who are the people of taqlid. The people who give their submission to the Imam al-Hayy al-Hazir al-Qa'im are the people of basira. This is the very gist of insight. And that is connected with the knowledge of God, with the knowledge of Toby. So in the Milal, in which he's not openly coming out as an Ismaili, he's mildly criticizing the followers of Hassan Sabbah, but in the Majlis, he's giving his own response. He's responding to his own critique here.
Yes. So you mentioned speaking about the connection between Shahrastani and the Ismaili and Shi'i doctrines. The terms taʿlīm and Qiyama are, of course, key terms also in Nizari Ismaili doctrine. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more on the Shahrastani's understanding of taʿlīm and Qiyama, and whether he understood Qiyama rationally and what was his vision of Qiyama, whether it comes close to what we observe in Nizari.
Well, this thing about taʿlīm is very interesting because I think to some extent Shahrastani is carrying over into his Nizari ideas aspects of his kalam training as an Ash'ari. I know this from the Quran commentary. And there he insists that, well, the kalam idea is basically that assent to religion has to begin in a rational inference. I think in a way both the Ash'aris and above all the Mu'tazilis say this. You have to reflect on the world and infer the existence of a deity, thence a deity who sends prophets, and then you submit to religion. It has to start in a rational inference. This is my understanding of it. So he is very keen to distinguish taʿlīm from servile conformism or taक़līd, because according to the Kalam schools, religion is invalidated if it's simply founded on servile conformism. You can't just accept what a person says because he tells you to accept it. So Shahrastani is very keen to say that taʿlīm, as you said, is a basira, it's an intellectual insight, it's based on intellectual insight and not taक़līd. And he actually brings forward various rational arguments for taʿlīm, quite a few of them, which I find interesting. And I could talk more about those arguments because they're quite interesting. And one of them I mentioned is the classic anti-skeptical argument that if you reduce all intellectual viewpoints and deny anything intellectually objective, as the skeptic proposes, it is self-confuting, because the skeptic is putting forward that argument as a unique exception to this ruling. So it is actually self-confuting. There must be a hierarchy in intellectual viewpoints. So that is one argument. Another is from the observation of hierarchies in nature, that human intelligence appears mu'jiz to animals. And we can extrapolate that there are species above human beings whose intellect is mu'jiz to human beings. And there are other arguments of this kind, but he's very keen to show that authoritative instruction, that cardinal principle of Ismailism, is not the same as taक़līd.
Yeah, there's one thing that I would add is that this theme of taʿlīm that Shahrastani develops is found in earlier Ismaili doctrine. In particular, one of those examples that very exquisitely and very eloquently elaborates on that one is the famous Qasida of Nasr Khusro's Confessional Ode, the Khan in which he goes through the explanation of how he became an Ismaili, in which he just covers exactly the same kind of hierarchy in terms of intellect. But then also it revolves around the very formulation of the doctrine of taʿlīm by Hasan Saffar, which he includes in his Arabic translation of the Fusul Arba in the Milal. So we've got this narrative of Shahrastani, and also we've got another reformulation of the same doctrine, of the same doctrine of the taʿlīm in Tusi's Sayr al-Suluk. So we've got the same narrative narrated by Shahrastani, by Nasr Khusro, and also later by Tusi in the Sayr al-Suluk. Now the key idea is that if anybody asks you, how do you know about this fundamental doctrine of La ilaha illallah, which is Tawheed, you would inevitably have to respond to this, that it was through Muhammad who brought this to us. Because if you could have come to that conclusion on your own, then you wouldn't need the Prophet. Then you already made that claim, which is what Toby just said. It's self-refuting. You're actually putting the rug from under your own feet. You're basically claiming that you are a prophet. So that element of rationality is fundamental to the extent that it reaches the knowledge of God. Anything below that point is the area where intellect is active. Anything above that one is something that requires the instruction. And then it is in this context that he offers his refutation against philosophers as well, because in this Suluk Tusi offers the same refutation that Shahrastani uses in the Majlis. Because in the Majlis, Shahrastani refutes philosophers generally, he refutes the Mushabbiha, he refutes the Ash'ari as well. So very specifically mentions these people and said these guys have missed the very key idea of the Toby. And that key idea is that you need somebody who knows God without any intermediary. And that person is the Mu'allif, is the Imam of the time, which is the key idea of taʿlīm.
What about Qiyama?
Qiyama. Well, I'll be frank, I mean, I have studied tafsir without this steady reference to the unfolding of the Nizari intellectual tradition. But it clearly does hark forward to the Qiyama and beyond to Tusi and so forth. I mean, the way I have come to this is actually through his dyad, another of these double principles, which is the accomplished and the unfolding, the mafruh wal musta'naf. So the accomplished is the divine point of view, the point of view from which realities are fixed in the divine omniscience eternally. And the musta'naf is the unfolding point of view on the basis of which we experience life with its moral answerability and its cause-effect sequences. And it's a very thought-provoking diet in terms of the philosophy of action. But getting to the Qiyama, I mean, I could talk a lot more about this because Shahrastani has a model for this from a hadith of the Prophet where he intervenes in an argument between Abu Bakr and Umar about free will and determinism. If everything is fixed and is already accomplished from the divine point of view, what is the point of acting? And the Prophet says counterintuitively, both points of view are right. You have to co-affirm the unfolding and the accomplished. And he refers them to this image of a great angel, which has a paradoxical constitution. It's a very thought-provoking image. The angel is half fire and half ice. The fire does not melt the ice or the thalj, the snow, and the ice does not extinguish the fire, but it subsists and praises God in its ongoing existence. How this, I mean, this also connects, of course, with about a third of the Majlis, which is the story of Moses and Khidr, but which is all about this distinction. I think how it connects with the Qiyama is that in his interpretation of verses on the afterlife, Shahrastani makes clear that you can come to a kind of perceptual threshold where you can actually see into the mafruh, the accomplished, the realities of the Qiyama within the musta'naf. It's a perceptual threshold that you can reach. You can see into the Qiyama. It's imminent. And this actually connects with chapter 5 of the Haft Bab, where Hassan II is quoted as saying, through the Cheshme Haqiqat, you can see the spiritual in the physical perceptual world around you. That is one way in which it harks forward to the Qiyama. But there must be many others actually when you have eyes to see it in Shahrastani.
If I may add something here. You see, when we talk about the Qiyama, if you look at the literature after Shahrastani, there is a definition that they give of the era of Qiyama. The era of Qiyama is a time when the element is a period when the element of time and the space is removed in worship. So when worship is not time bound, it becomes the worship of Qiyama. And when it is time bound, when you do it at particular times and particular places, it becomes the Sharia. Now, in the conversation between Musa and Piz, Musa is a man of Sharia because everything that he does is time bound. He needs to have evidence in order to act upon this judgment, to pass a verdict. Khizr does not need this because he's above time and above space. And as a result, Khizr becomes the man of Qiyama, or Khizr becomes an allegory or a symbol for the Qa'im. It means that Khizr could actually lift these ritual laws and give them the very core, the very gist, the very soul of the worship. And it is precisely here that the term that Shahrastani uses is the distinction between ta'at and between ma'rifat. So ta'at refers to the practice of ritual law in terms of the Sharia, and ma'rifat has got to do with qiyāmat. So the characters of Moses and Khizr are precisely like the characters of the Imam and the Prophet working together. Now in this case it becomes the Qa'im who's giving them the idea of the mafruq, which has already been decided. It doesn't matter what time and what space you're in.
Yes, he makes these parallels in the tafsir. So the unfolding point of view is proper to the Sharia with its moral answerability and so forth. And that is promulgated by prophets. The Sharia is promulgated by prophets. The accomplished point of view is proper to the Qiyama and is presided over by imams. And I would also suggest that there is another way in which I said Shahrastani harks forward to what is about to happen 10 years after his death in 1164, the Qiyama, which is his theory of naskh, of abrogation, which he returns to often. He is very Sharia conscious himself, I have to say. He sees the religious law as a kind of blueprint for the Qiyama in some ways. But he's very clear in his teaching on abrogation that it is not an annulment of the prior law, but it's perfection. So it's a subsumptive model of abrogation. In annulling law, you are not negating it. You are converting it into a further stage which contains the prior stage. I think this is relevant to the Qiyama.
Thank you. You already mentioned several issues which are connected to the terminology used by Shahrastani and his technical terms. Are there something in the language of technical language used by Shahrastani which echoes more directly in Nizari literature?
Yeah, I think this is one of those fascinating things that it took me a while to figure out. There are two terms that Shahrastani frequently uses. These are Hanifiya and Sabwa. So in the second part of the Milal, Shahrastani talks about the people who follow the pristine faith, now connected very clearly to Ibrahim, and then the Sabians. Now, the Sabi'a, when he offers an interpretation of that, the Sabi'a are the people who want to go and know God through speculating in the world in which they live. But the Hanifiya are the people who believe in the intermediary of a person. And that goes back to the story of Ibrahim. Now, it sounds a little bit contradictory because in the stories that we see that, now this story is narrated by Al-Mu'ayyad al-Shirazi, by Qazi al-Numan. You find it in the Paradise of Submission as well, the story that Ibrahim comes out of his cave and he starts looking at the stars and the moons and then the sun. And then he believes that I need something, I need a guide which does not set, which does not disappear, referring to the Imam who's always to the Hayy and Hazir and Qa'id. Now, what he argues here is that all of these other ranks, because the moon and the star and the sun are referring to the ranks of the teachers that they've got, they fade away, and it is only the Imam of the time who's always present, and that person is the manifestation of God's command. And then there is a phrase that he uses in the Majlis, and that phrase is also used late in Nizari text, and he says, Al-Hanifiyatu Niyabatu Raja. Now, in the original texts which were published before, not in my edition, Jalaluddin Aini had misread the text from the manuscript. So he had written that as al-Hanifiyatu Nabahatu Rijal, which was very clearly, if he had read the tafsir, he would have known that the term is niyaba, which is deputyship, which is the intermediary of a person, of an individual, which brings us to the term of tashakhus. So the Imam becomes the embodiment of the truth. If you were going to show the Imam in a physical, the truth in a physical form, it will point to the person of the Imam of the time, which is the distinction between Hanifiya and Sabba. So, Toby, if you want to add a few more things on this.
But Shahrastani is somehow obsessed with the Sabian religion. About 60 pages of the modern edition by Muhanna and Fa'ur of the Book of Religions, 60 pages of it is dedicated to this debate between the Hanifs and the Sabians. It's a slightly complicated story. I mean, you've already discussed it to some extent, but the main thing is that Sabianism is a kind of heresiographical construct that Shahrastani uses, through which he categorizes a great deal of non-Abrahamic religion throughout its history. This is a slightly sort of strange association. He takes the idea initially from this surviving Chaldean pagan community in Haran, in northern Mesopotamia, eastern Turkey now. They survived just about into Shahrastani's lifetime. To defend themselves at the time of the Abbasid Caliph Ma'mun, they identify themselves with the mysterious Sabi'a mentioned in the Quran as a protected community, as a respectable religion. On that basis, Shahrastani has to take seriously that it is in its origins an authentic, revealed religious system. And he says that it was promulgated initially by the prophet sages Hermes Trismegistus and Agathodaimon, Idris and Seth in Islamic parlance. But they deviated, and he actually maps out their various stages of deviation in the tafsir. Their primary deviation, through which they become the perennial opponents of Abrahamic monotheism, is, as you said, they insist that the mediators between human beings and God cannot simply be other human beings. They must be spiritual in their constitution. So he sometimes calls them the ashab al-ruhaniyat, the adherents of spirit beings. We might think of them as angels, but in practice what it refers to is the astral religion of the Haranians, this Chaldean pagan community. So they propitiated planetary spirits as their means of access to God. And Nefitism comes to correct this throughout its history. And it insists that human beings are mediators of God. And of course, in Shahrastani's understanding, the ultimate flowering of the Hanif faith, Abrahamic monotheism, is Islam. And he notes that the Islamic confession of faith turns out to be two confessions. It's pristine monotheism, no God but God. But it is also Muhammad is the messenger of God. And this is emphasizing that human beings act as mediators with God. To say something slightly controversial, though, I do think that his prophetology and his imamology bears the trace of Sabianism. He takes on their view to some extent because he distinguishes two aspects to these elect human beings. There is mushabaha, or similarity, from which point of view they are other human beings, but there is also mubayyana, dissimilarity, from which point of view they transcend the rest of humanity. If you like, they're almost spiritual beings. But he traces this idea that monotheism goes with confessing the special relationship of the one true God with certain elect human individuals throughout humanity, points out in the Quran, thereby the Bible, that God is often referred to in an idafa relationship with these elect individuals, a genitive relationship, the God of Moses, the Lord of Moses and Aaron, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and so forth. He's very insistent on this. Yeah.
Yeah, if I may add one quick sentence to make it a little bit simpler than the rather sophisticated language that Toby used. So that it's very interesting that throughout the Majlis, he's using these terms Hanifiya and the Saba as some kind of code words, if you want to simplify it. For him, in the Ismaili context, the Ismailis are Hanifi because they believe in the teaching of the Muallim, and that Muallim is the personification of the truth for them. And all others, the people who do not accept this intermediate, the mediation of that Imam, that Rajul that he's using, become the people of the Saba. These are the followers of the same faith. So in a sense, it also falls into the category of Tazad, Tarattub, and Wahdat. So the people of Wahdat are the people who acknowledge this pristine faith, and the people who follow the doctrine of Qiyāmat and who accept the teaching of the Imam al-Hayy al-Hazir
Khan. Thank you. And perhaps the last question for discussion, because I'm mindful of our time limits. Shahrastani's intellectual identity can be sometimes confusing. What was his position with regard to different currents of thought that existed at his time?
Yeah. Well, I maintain that his Ismaili thought actually does bear a strong trace from Ash'arism for a start. He does criticize Ash'arism from various points of view, but its trace is clearly there in his Ismaili thought. He's fiercely critical of the Mu'tazilites. His whole relationship with philosophy is a very intriguing question here. Falsafa, well, he of course is a famous critic of Ibn Sina, but philosophy is not identical to Avicennism. It's not coterminous with this movement of Avicennan philosophy. He takes over this phrase from Nasir al-Khosrow, the title of Nasir al-Khosrow's book, The Jami' al-Hikmatain, the merger of the two wisdoms, namely religion and philosophy. And he presents his Ismaili system as the merger of religion and philosophy. So he does have a strongly philosophical sensibility. And his system responds to many philosophical issues as well. But yes, I think he did have a, as one would think, he has an Ash'ari persona in public, and he is definitely an Ismaili in private. So, yes, that's what I'd say.
Yeah, perhaps one quick comment that I would add is that we know from the Majlis that he's mentioned a number of people. So when he refers to the philosophers, he calls them Yahl al-Nazar, the same term that Tusi uses in Sayr al-Suluk, which is on the subject of the knowledge of God. But other areas, he doesn't have any issues. I mean, even when we look at the Musara, when he's critical of Ibn Sina, the main area of contention is the knowledge of God. How can you do that? And it is in contradistinction with that formulation that Hassan Safwa has. And it's very interesting that there is a tension here. We know that Tusi loves Ibn Sina. And we also know that Shahrastani doesn't like Ibn Sina. So he writes a critique of Ibn Sina, then Tusi writes a critique of the critique of Ibn Sina. And we could see this tension going on until the end of the Arabic period, that as much as Shahrastani is trying to keep Ibn Sina away from Ismailis, and Tusi is trying to drag him in. And it's quite evident in the language of the Rawzai Taslim, particularly in the opening chapters, you see the influence of Ibn Sina there. But as you move forward, you also see the influence of Shahrastani. So it's a melting pot of Messina and Shahrastani and Tusi, and at the same time you're bringing them all together. So it's kind of an uneasy coexistence, if you like.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this stimulating discussion. And we have some time for questions now. Please.
Thank you very much, and can I have two questions? I try to make it short. The first one is about said about the story of Khidr and Musa, and you mentioned about the notion of time. But there is another thing which is actually akhbar, or knowledge, because in the story, when Musa claims that Khidr can find him sabur, steadfast, then Khidr responds that how can you be steadfast, sabur, when you don't have an akhbar or knowledge? So what's your view about instead of time to move it towards knowledge? Yeah, because it is not about, at least according to my understanding, not about time, but about knowledge, which is more important. Even not knowledge, but just akhbar. Yeah, khabar. And the second question is just about how to make Shahrastani to specifically makes him like being Ismaili. I don't know to what extent it is important to know, but the thing is that just by using Mu'allim's or like this, we know that it was refuted by Ghazali very professionally. That, even when he said that Ismaili are saying that, yeah, you mean Mu'allim Sadiq, we say that our Mu'allim Sadiq is Prophet Muhammad. And when you said that, but he is dead, we also said that, but your Imam is also absent. So, in this case, by using just these terms in Shahrastani or in other art scholars, we still cannot claim that they are Ismailis. What are the other, probably more strong evidence that claims them Ismaili?
Yeah, so
Thank you very much.
Go back to your first question. So in terms of this idea of knowledge, I think it is interconnected with the element of time, because when Khidr is telling Musa, and then he says, how can you be patient with me when you do not have knowledge of this? So this knowledge is the knowledge of the decrees which go beyond the limitation of time and space. So the three examples which he gives in terms of, for example, Khidr killing that young child and claiming that he's going to become a corrupt person, and Musa argues that this hasn't happened yet. He says, for you it hasn't happened, for me it has already happened. I know that this is what is going on. It is happening in a different world. You do not have the knowledge of it. The knowledge that things can happen without the element of time. So that is the key. So it's interconnected with the same idea. Now, in terms of the idea of Shahrastani being an Ismaili or a senior figure of it, it's not, of course, that's nothing to do with just the idea of Mu'allim Sadiq. There are so many things which are found in the Milan, in the Mafatih, in the Tafsir, and also in the Majlis, which are exclusively Ismaili ones. I mean, the Mafruq and Mustanaf, the Tazad, the Tarattub, and Rahta, these are the terminologies that no other person other than Ismailis ever used. I mean, going back to the critique of Shahrastani of al-Ghazali was referring to Imam Ma'soom. Well, I have not seen anything in the language of Hassan Sabbah to refer to it as Imam Ma'soom, is referring to as Imam Sadiq. The idea of Isma was also, it had a different narrative in the Alawite period. But beyond that point, the terminology that Shahrastani uses is the terminology that only Nizari Ismaili uses. No other community uses. So it would be very strange to believe that it could have come from a different perspective. And as Toby mentioned, when he's talking, when he's criticizing a Shi'at al-Amma, Shi'at al-Muntazira, he's making a distinction between the Ismailis and the al-Shahrastani. So he's very openly critical of them. So as Toby mentioned, by a sheer process of elimination, no other community would be left other than Nizari Ismailis, unless we could imagine that there was a community of believers around Shahrastani, which included him and a handful of people, and nobody knew about them, which is very odd. It sounds very strange. In what kind of a universe we could create a community of believers with these ideas and nobody subscribed to them? And one of the things we need to remember is that during his own lifetime, when people said that Shahrastani engaged in the darkness of philosophy, it was exactly the kind of argument which was used against Ismailis, not against just philosophers. So when they were looking at his language, the language was unmistakable from the language of the Ismailis, which is why it was targeted at that time. So they could see very clearly that this is the language of Ismailis. And of course, it was later on forgotten. I mean, if you move throughout history, apart from his contemporary people, I've created a list of all those people who've given their position on the faith of Shahrastani. The people close to him, almost all of them are suspecting that he could be an Ismaili. It's only 2 or 3 centuries later that people start coming up with all kinds of theories that he could not be an Ismaili, he's an Ash'ari theologian. But then until the 20th and 21st century, it becomes pretty much established that his Ismaili affiliations are unmistakable.
And not least, Nasir ad-Din al-Tusi's reference to him in Sayr Saluk as being the starting point of his family connection with the Dawah, and he refers to him with the title Da'i ad-Du'at, and he refers back to Shahrastani, about a century after Shahrastani.
Yes, perhaps we can take a question. Okay.
My name is Nizar Jafar Boy. I think in Quran, Allah says that, He created his creation, in 6 days. So I would just like to ask that, are there any theories as to the explanation or the significance of 6 days, keeping in mind kun fayakun, Allah says be, and it is. Thank you.
Okay, let me say very quickly. This is a very common Ismaili thing. It goes back to the Fatimid period, and the Nizaris also make the same kind of esoteric interpretation. For them, the 6 days are allegorical. It's not literal 6 days. You don't have the element of time very clearly, because the day, if you imagine the creation, human beings understand day with the rising and setting of the physical sun. The physical sun is not there yet. The only thing which is used by Ismailis is that each day is referring to the cycle of each prophet who's bringing a new law, which is starting with Adam, ending with Muhammad, which is the 6th day, and the 7th one, which is the day of Sabbath, which is Saturday, is a day which is a symbol for the Qa'im. So the 7th one is the Qa'im who's unveiling the esoteric meanings of all that was encapsulated in the teaching and the preaching of the earlier prophets, and that is how they understand it. So it is a common thing. You also find the same thing in Shahrastani in the Majlis, and as Toby mentioned this about the nullification or abrogation, the Qa'im is the one who's actually bringing it to life. Now, it's interesting that in the in Paradox of Submission in al-Shahrastani, the allegory is used. It's just like the allegory of a fetus in the womb, in the mother's womb, going through the stages which are used in the Quran. Then the moment the child is born, the baby is born, it is the moment of perfection. So if the baby is not pulled out of the mother's womb, the baby would die. So it doesn't consider the abrogation as a death or something. It is giving the new life to all the earlier stages of the formation and development of that fetus, which is the religious law with the intervention of the Qa'im.
Let's take maybe one question from our online audience.
Yeah, we've got a question from Karen Pinto, who says, what is Shahrastani's view on anthropomorphism?
Well, that's an intriguing question. Certainly in his in the Nihaya, in his Ash'ari context, he will have a simple Ash'ari view of it, which is al-ithbat bi ghayri tashbih, that you confirm what God says about himself in the Quran, but without anthropomorphism. So it's a rather nuanced interpretation which keeps God's transcendence, but also what the Quran says, how God describes himself in the Quran. In the Ismaili context, of course, Shahrastani is emphatic that God is beyond all predication or human understanding, completely elevated above human predication. This is a very important principle in his entire theology. What he does say, however, is that when the Quran refers to God using apparently anthropomorphic terms, they must be interpreted according to equivocity. They mean something completely different from what would be normal for human communication. In a way, you can see some connection there between his Ismaili thought and his Ash'ari thought. It amounts to a very similar point of view. He says that these theological descriptions must be interpreted strictly according to equivocity. Human beings cannot conceive of what they mean. But Shahrastani's concept of God, typical of the Ismaili tradition in general, is extremely transcendental. He even elevates him above being.
The only point about anthropomorphism is that we know that in the Ismaili tradition and in the context of the Hanifiya, the Hanifiya is the deputation of the Rajal, of the men, and these men are the embodiment of God's command. They're not the embodiment of God. That's the key thing. So for him, the Imam is elevated to the position that if God's command had a physical expression in the world, that would be in the body, in the very person of the Imam. So it's when you look at the Imam, it's as if you see God. Now, this is nothing other than a reiteration of that famous tradition attributed to Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq when he says, "Nahnu asma'ullah al-husna, fasifatuhu al-ulya, wa bana yu'rafullahu, wa bana yuta'u, wa bana yusal." We are the most supreme names of God. And it's there's plenty of references to these kinds of traditions from early Imams. I think Amir Muizzi offers a very extensive repository of traditions like this, which refer to this status of the Imams. But the key thing is that the similarity, the common ground of humanity is important, that the Imam is a human being, and that does not make him deity, that doesn't make the Imam God. So the Imam is not God, but the Imam is not separate from God. So it's something like if you like, the idea of Hallaj's annihilation with God.
Unfortunately, our time is over here and we have to stop our discussions. Thank you very much, Daryoush and Toby, and Daryoush, congratulations again on the publication of this book. Thank you to everyone for attending this event. Thank you. And Lucian has a few announcements for us.
Yes, thank you all very, very much for joining us in person and online. And thank you once again to our wonderful speakers for that very thought-provoking and engaging discussion. Please join me in giving them another round of applause. Before we conclude, there's just a couple of dates for your diaries on forthcoming events. On Friday, the 25th of March, Dr. Faisal Devji from Oxford University will be delivering a keynote address entitled The Proper Name. This address is part of the workshop on the study of Islam at the End of Empire, which is moderated by Dr. Toshif Kara and convened by the Centre of Islamic Studies in Cambridge and the Institute of Ismaili Studies. So registration to attend that keynote event, either in person or online, is now open. On Thursday, the 28th of April, we have the next lecture in the Islamic History and Thought lecture series, titled Soul's Imaginal Motion in Abu Yaqub al-Sijistani's Kitab al-Maqalid and Risala al-Bahira. This lecture will be delivered online by Dr. Elizabeth Alexandrine from the University of Manitoba in Canada. For more information on both of these events and forthcoming events, please visit the Institute's website, www.iis.ac.uk. Thank you once again, and please join us outside for some light refreshments.